Hi, good afternoon. My name is Dan Tadmor, or in Hebrew, Dan Tadmor. I'm the president and CEO of the Weizmann National Museum of American Jewish History. For the past 13 years, I've been involved in the transformation of two major Jewish museums. First, transforming what used to be Bet Futsot, the Diaspora Museum, into what is now Anu, Museum of the Jewish People. And since January, we've begun to do a similar transformation in Philadelphia at the Weizmann Museum. Show of hands, who's been to the Weizmann? Oh, that's pretty good. All right, okay. And to Bet Futsot and to Anu? No, okay. A completely new museum, same building on the Tel Aviv University campus. Huge museum, 72,000 square feet of exhibition space, but 30 tons of old museum from 1978 went out, and a whole totally new museum with new themes, and I'm going to say a little bit about that in the next few minutes. So what we're going to talk about are three interrelated things. One is I'm going to talk about what museums are and aren't. Two, and related to that, is how they display things like relationships and narratives, such as the relationship between the two great Jewish communities of our time, Israel and North America. And finally, because museums, at least in part, are static, right? You take a snapshot and you build a museum, although I will say in a minute that that is not the full picture. If forced to take a snapshot right now, what would I think that it would have to include? And then B, the executive director of the Capitol Jewish Museum here in Washington, D.C., will also come to the stage and talk, and then we'll have a conversation, and then hopefully some questions and answers. So museums. Let's talk about what a museum isn't. A museum is not an academic endeavor. Is Jonathan Sarna in the room? Okay. That is not to say, Jonathan Sarna, among many other things, is the chief historian of the Weizmann. So that is not to say that a museum can be anything other than academically solid. However, unlike the academic pursuit, it is an endeavor in which you choose narratives and you choose statements and you decide what goes in and what stays out. And therefore, we need to align our expectations. Another way in which a museum is not an academic endeavor is that it is intended for mass consumption. It's a mass medium. A museum that doesn't get a large enough audience has failed as a museum. And when we create museums, we need to make sure that we're being communicative. And there's a lot of ways of doing it, and there's a lot of ways of saying things when you want to say them in a museum. You can say them through an artifact, a three-dimensional thing. You can use an image. You can use text. You can use media, which is museum speak for films. You can use interactive. More and more museums are interactive because, one, it's fun. Two, it's a good way of stacking more information using less space. We sometimes tend to forget that there's an audio guide that allows you another layer of information. We sometimes tend to forget that there are guides and docents, although not always, and whatever they impart is also another layer of information. So it's actually more like 7 ways of stating things. But whatever they are, if you're a good museum, they better be communicative and they better suit the various audience groups that you want to visit your museum. Here are some common misconceptions about museums. One, very often people think that what they want to say has to be said through a museum. There are many museums that should have never been built because they could have been a book and they could have been a documentary and they could have been a lecture series. But somebody had the idea that they need to say this as a museum. Those are the ones that once they open and once the fanfare of the opening subsides, those are the ones that struggle. By the way, Good museums don't struggle. Sorry, let me correct that. Museums are a terrible business, and in fact, they're not a business. And although museums have revenue, or have earned revenue streams, I don't know of any museum that is actually, that can actually survive solely on earned revenue. Without philanthropy or some sort of state support, federal, whatever, museums cannot survive. But the good museums remain relevant. And the way they remain relevant is that people come through their doors. Another common misconception about museums is that people tend to forget that a museum is not only the exhibition or exhibitions. Museums are also education, which is all of the educational programming that a museum administers on-site, sometimes online and off-site. At the Weizmann, we're a national museum. Some of the education that we do happens throughout the country. The other thing people forget is public programming. So in museum theory, the way that you keep a museum relevant and you give people a reason to come back is through special exhibitions or changing exhibitions. However, let me tell you from 13 years of experience, blockbuster changing exhibitions are few and far between. For one, you never know whether your exhibition is going to be a blockbuster. Professor Sarna is advising us now on a major exhibition that we're opening in April for the semi-quincentennial. We think it's going to be a blockbuster. We've invested a lot of time, energy, and quite frankly, money in wanting it to be a blockbuster. But who knows? You never know. So the topic is, well, it's called The First Salute. And it begins on I'm straying from my notes, but I was asked a question. So on November 16th, 1776, a ship called Andrew Doria, not the Andrea Doria, although named after the same Italian captain. One of the first 4 U.S. Navy ships was 1776. The newly minted United States took 4 ships and called them a navy. This ship enters the port of St. Eustatius. Who here has heard of St. Eustatius? No one. Yofi Onatan. It's a tiny island in the Caribbean. The ship is carrying a copy of the Declaration of Independence. That's what the U.S. was doing then. It was declaring its independence. How do you do that in 1776? You take a copy, send one to Amsterdam, send one to Paris, don't send one to London, send one to St. Eustatius, which at the time was a very, very important place. It was one of the busiest harbors in the world, doing much of the commerce between the colonies in Europe. It's a really important place. And as the Andrew Doria enters the harbor of St. Eustatius, it gives a 13-gun salute, one for each state. And then the Dutch governor, it's a Dutch free port, the Dutch governor of St. Eustatius responds with a salute of his own. 11, you respond with 2 less than you were given. It's maritime custom that I now know. That is the first recognition of the United States internationally. And that's why it's called the First Salute. Why is it in the Jewish Museum? Well, one, this Jewish Museum is on Independence Mall, and it's the semi-quincentennial. But it's got a very interesting Jewish perspective, and that is that about 25% of the European population of that island were Jews. Mainly Spanish, Portuguese Jews, Sephardic. Expulsion of Spain and Portugal, 1492, 1496. Holland colonizes. The first to go are Jews. Why did Jews go? Looking for more opportunity and religious freedom. And so it's a very Jewish island. These Jewish merchants were the #1 suppliers to the American Revolution, mainly of gunpowder. Without that stuff being smuggled out of St. Eustatius, the outcome could have been very different. So much so, and I did not intend to, am I boring you guys? Okay, sorry. So the end of the story, here's a spoiler, but come see the exhibition. Is there a? In fact, Barbara Tuchman's last book, published in the late 80s, was called The First Salute. And despite the fact that Barbara Tuchman tells at least parts of this story, and it's Barbara Tuchman, this whole thing has been under the radar. It's really weird. There's not a room that I go into where people had heard any of this. And it's all true, ask Professor Sarna. Which, by the way, is the first thing that we did when we came up with this topic. We needed to know that it is academically solid. Our first address was Jonathan. It becomes such a problem for the British that they declare war on Holland, invade the island, take it over. One Admiral Rodney, leading a fleet of 13 ships, takes over the island and then proceeds to mistreat the Jews specifically. He raids graves, he strips them naked, he banishes some of the men, he takes everything they own. In an act of, today we'd call it anti-Semitism. The term didn't exist then. It's a 19th century term, but this was anti-Semitism. So much so that in British Parliament, none other than Edmund Burke gets up to speak and says, I'm paraphrasing here, it's a mark of shame on England that we so mistreat the Jews, these Jews who have no one to protect them, no country of their own. This is Edmund Burke in British Parliament attacking the actions of Admiral Rodney. The final piece is that Admiral Rodney had a second mission, which was to try and intercept the French fleet that was underway to help the Patriots. He's so busy looting St. Eustatius and mistreating the Jews that he neglects that second mission. The French arrived at Chesapeake Bay, blockaded, right, Professor Sarna? I'm not sure. Yeah. And anyway, lend the Patriots a significant hand in the victory at Yorktown. Jewish story, American story, a wonderful story to tell on the 250th. But I digress. So, but it's a good example of what museums do. So museums need to make content choices. We need to decide historically what we're covering. So the Weizmann Museum currently begins in 1654. We all know why, 1654, the first 23 Jews arrive in America from Recife. It makes sense. The choice could have been to start it in 70 AD, as Beit HaTfutzot did, right? If you remember the Diaspora Museum, Arch of Titus opens the museum. It's a decision. So a decision of historical scope is a decision. There's no right or wrong. It's an editorial or curatorial decision. Anu now, for those of you who have been there, really, I mean, there's a film that takes you back to Abraham, but it really begins in 586 BC with the destruction of the first temple and the age of antiquity. That's a choice. Could have been 70 AD. It was 70 AD. Could have been, I don't know, the advent of Zionism. Could have been a lot of things, but it's a decision to be made. So historically, or the historical scope is a decision. Geographic. So the Weizmann is the National Museum of American Jewish History. So its geographical focus is on telling the American Jewish story. Anu calls itself, because I called it, Museum of the Jewish People. And so the story that it tells tries to encompass the entire Jewish world, not without controversy. So many, or some Israelis coming to Anu complain that, where's Israel? Right? Of course it's there. But it's there in what the curators and decision makers at Anu, me being one of them, decided that it was the correct proportionality, right? So geographical scope is another decision that needs to be made. And then finally, there are thematic choices. So in a Jewish museum, is there a section that deals with Jewish values? You could tell the Jewish story without going into values. You could tell it chronologically and not go into values. And if you decide that you're going into values, which values do you focus on? Tikkun Olam, yes, no. Is it the one overriding value, which seems to have been, at least for 20 years or more, sort of the going norm? What about other values? How do you present them? Do you present them as Jewish values, or do you present them as values that may have started with the Jewish people but have been universalized? I think that's your opinion, Jonathan, that there really isn't such a thing as Jewish values, and in as much as there were values that began with the Jewish people, they've now been universalized, right? It's a decision. It's a content decision to be made. What do you do with Jewish achievement? The very choice of words. Do you say achievement or do you say contribution? Right? We have a tendency of not wanting to call attention to Jewish excellence, so let's call it contribution. I don't know that everybody does that, but it's a decision to be made. The Weitzman, the reason that it is on Independence Mall, 14 minutes already. I'm sorry. I'm going to speed things up. The reason that it's on Independence Mall is certainly not because it was the cheapest real estate in Philadelphia. It wasn't. It is because there's a statement behind it. And the statement is that the American Jewish story is what happens when people, after arguably 2,000 years, are afforded the liberty and opportunity to thrive. And what happens is they thrive. And so the immigrant experience is certainly a part of the Weitzman. But sometimes I wonder, or increasingly I wonder, if you talk to a young person, a young Jewish person today, who's by now, what, 5th generation? Is the immigrant experience relevant to them? Is it part of their self-identity? Does a young American Jew, 4th or 5th generation, see themselves as descendants of immigrants? Or no, I'm here, I'm American. And what difference does it make whether my ancestors came in 1780 or 1880, right? The further you go, it becomes almost meaningless. Or you could argue that is. So all of these, I'm not proposing the answer. I'm just posing the kind of questions that you need to address. When we were talking before, me and Bea, so I have an affinity for Jewish mobsters. It's like a hobby of mine. And at the Weitzman, there's a little section that mentions it. I know, and I'm not going to go into names, but a significant Jewish foundation would have nothing to do with the Weitzman, because the guy behind it says, why are we showing this stuff, right? Let me encourage you to go see the Mob Museum in Vegas. It's a wonderful Jewish museum. But today we're talking about relationships. And when presenting the Jewish story, whether in Tel Aviv or in Philadelphia, you unavoidably want to address the question of what is the relationship between these two great communities comprising of some 90% of Jews living in the world today, Israel and North America. The first thing I want to say is that it's relationships with an S. It's not a relationship. It can never be a relationship. It's a matrix of 3 factors that are constantly shifting. One is various segments in society, right? A Hasidic person from wherever in America and a secular Jew in America would probably have a different relationship with their Israel, right? A settler from the West Bank and a secular Tel Avivi would have a different relationship with American Jews. I'm not going to attempt a taxonomy or typology of all these different segments, but let's agree that it's not one relationship, and among other things, it relies on the segment of the population. The second factor is that there are long-term trends within those segments. The last would be the short-term seminal events, but before seminal events, there are long-term trends. I'll talk about one in Israel. Those who visited the Diaspora Museum may remember that it was a thematic museum. So its founding curator, Abba Kovner, when they were trying to wrap their heads around how do we tell Jewish history, he came up with the idea that we'll tell it thematically. And he picked 7 themes and he called them gates. So there's the gate of community and faith, whatever, but it all ends with the gate of return. You physically ascend, and that's the end of the museum. And the implication, of course, was that this is the end of Jewish history because now Israel is an independent country. And the implication was that if you don't make Aliyah, there's something wrong with you, either as a person or a Jew or both. But you're irrelevant because your history as a non-Israeli Jew is destined to wither and disappear. It's a statement and a choice. And it was very reflective. So the Diaspora Museum opened in '78. It was 10 years in the making. So when they started thinking about stuff, it was still the '60s. This is a very, very reflective of what is referred to in Hebrew as shlilat hagola, and is commonly translated as negation of the diaspora, but it's really not negation. It's disapproval of. It's delegitimization of. Shlila means an active distaste for, okay? But what was reflective in 1978 was not that reflective in '98 or in 2008. Israeli society had changed the way that it looks on the diaspora. But trends are always shifting. So within parts of Israeli society, Shlilat HaGola has made a return. I would, in very gross and vulgar terms, the more conservative and religious you are, the less that you the more ethnocentric that you are, and the less favorably you view the diaspora. So within segments of society, there are long-term trends. In the previous session, somebody mentioned the generational gap in America, which is a trend, right? For, again, a gross generalization, but young American Jews on the whole, for them, the state of Israel plays less of a central part. Well, one thing to remember is that people don't remain 20 forever. We always, whenever we're shocked and appalled at some of the things we see on campus, we forget that we don't say, unfortunately, we don't stay 20 forever. I heard this on a podcast not long ago, and it was like an aha moment. 11 years after the Summer of Love, Ronald Reagan was elected president here. Okay? But yeah, there's a trend. And the trend did not begin with October 7th and its aftermath. And it did not begin with agreement or disagreement over what Israel is doing was doing in Gaza. It's been a trend for a while. So, and again, I'm not attempting a taxonomy or typology of trends, but just let's recognize the fact that segments, and there are overriding or big trends within those segments. And then finally, there are seminal events. Some seminal events influence the relationship between American and North American Jews. Some influence only people with are intra that community. I would say, again, on the whole, if you talk about things that that are within the community. So the Soviet Jewry movement in America was a big deal. For people of a certain generation, it was a formative experience for their identity as Jews. Did it affect their relationship to Israel? I'm not so sure. It was something that happened within the Jewish American community. In Israel, you know, I'm running out of time, so I'll skip the examples. But some things definitely do affect the relationship. The 6-Day War affected the relationship. For a lot of American Jews, that was a watershed moment. Their relationship to Israel was born on that day, or the intensity of it was born on that day. So with regard to our current time and October 7th, you ask yourself, which is it? Is this an intra or an inter? Is this something that affects both societies internally, or does it affect the relationship between these two great societies? And I would argue that it's both. So in America, October 7th and its aftermath has, one could say, has one silver lining, and that is what is referred to as the surge, which is the growing interest of some Jewish Americans in their Jewish identity. There's a completely noticeable uptick in communal events, in conversions. couples that have been together for 15 years, one of them is Jewish, the other isn't, suddenly the non-Jewish partner feels an urge to convert to Judaism. Rabbis are reporting 100% increase in conversions. Will it last? I don't know. I was just talking to Shmuel before that. I think it will. I think this is one of these seminal events that has affected American Jewish identity. It's changed the vector. But who knows, right? It's very difficult. These extrapolations seldom work. In the previous session, somebody asked a question about Haredis not participating in the workforce, and there have been people who have been anticipating the collapse of Israel for 30 years because of the Haredis. What didn't they see when they extrapolated? They didn't see that participation in the workforce of Haredi women is higher than secular women. This is something that's happened in the last 15 years, right? Haredi women, for whatever reason, are sick and tired of being poor, and they go out to work, okay? In great numbers. Shmuel can give us the stats. But, yeah. Who could have guessed, right? So the household is participating in Israeli economy. All that to say that extrapolations seldom work. In Israel, the parallel of the effect of October 7th on unity waned after a few months, right? Israel, within 6 months, Israel was back to the rifts and the cleavages even more than before, right? It didn't last. The effect didn't last. The unifying effect, and I think it's a testament to how bad the situation in Israel is in that respect, it subsided. It went back to what it was within months. So it's difficult to say, although I believe that within American society, it is long-term. Israel is becoming increasingly ethnocentric. This didn't begin with October 7th, but it certainly got a boost with October 7th. What does that mean for the relationship with American Jews? Well, one of the things that began way before October 7th is a doctrine that's sometimes referred to as the Dermer Doctrine, named after a former Israeli ambassador to the United States, and then a government minister and advisor to Bibi Netanyahu. The Dermer Doctrine basically it's based on an interview that he once gave. At least 50% of American Jews, half American Jews are going to disappear anyway. Let's put all our chips on evangelicals. That's the Dermer Doctrine, okay? But for Israelis who are completely ignorant of the Dermer Doctrine, for some ethnocentric Israelis, it's either come fight with us and die with us, or shut up. That has certainly increased since October 7th. What will it mean long term? Difficult to say. Even before that, I would say most Israelis were completely ignorant regarding this big community here. Israelis know very little about American Jewry. There are a lot of reasons for that. At least one of them is that the people that determine the history that's being taught are the people themselves. And so not many people in Israel came from America. Israel was founded by Eastern Europeans, so everybody knew about the shtetl. Then came the big revolution of introducing the Mizrahi narrative into the education system, the Beaton Committee and other things. But why? Because somebody was there to speak on behalf of that community. There's never been in Israel a big enough American community to speak on behalf half of the Jewish people. Okay? And I'm afraid that indifference or ignorance will probably persist or even get worse. So again, I'm sorry, I don't have anything definitive to say about the relationship, except that it will shift and move, and that it's not a singular relationship. But since we're a museum, and museums, as I said, have to take some sort of snapshot, at least with regard to their core exhibition, if I had to take a snapshot now, which I kind of do because we're we're reimagining the Weitzman. So sometime within the next 5 years, we'll have to, or 4, we'll have to answer the question, what do we have to say about the overriding relationship between these two great communities? I'm going to predict that for the most part, it will remain a warm relationship of Jewish peoplehood. Regardless of several processes that are happening in both communities, there is an underlying sense of Jewish peoplehood. And I think that for the most part, that's the core narrative of that relationship. In America, peoplehood got a boost after October 7th, but regardless, and even with all the things that I said about some segments in Israeli society being indifferent to or having a sense of negativity towards the diaspora, we sometimes tend to underestimate the strength of Jewish peoplehood. Jewish peoplehood is the reason that I got involved in Jewish museums, didn't grow up in museums, had a whole first career in media, but I'm a big believer in Jewish peoplehood. We bicker and fight over a lot of things, and we tend to overlook the fact that when it comes to the crunch, for the most part, peoplehood survives. The other thing that I would say is that it has never been and will never be a symmetrical relationship. The hard fact is that American Jews think about Israel more often than Israeli Jews think about American Jews. And it plays a more significant part in their life, and it always will. It's just the way it is. Nothing's going to change that. It's not a value judgment. I'm not saying if it's good or bad. I'm saying it's a fact. And I don't see that anytime soon, the overriding sentiment, sure, there will be, look, on the fringes, it could end in divorce. I can imagine some Americans saying, this Israel, or even Israel, I don't want any part of it anymore. It's just strayed too far from who I am. I could see some American Jews for social or even economic reasons or career reasons, shying away from their Judaism, or at least from their Zionism, right? We're in a university. I don't know if it's worthwhile today to declare yourself a Zionist, at least in some departments. And we know that historically, whether you go all the way back to Gustav Mahler and Heinrich Heine, or you just go back to people changing their name. And by the way, I just finished reading Pamela Nadel's brilliant new book, Anti-Semitism in American Tradition. And in it, she mentions, although she's not the first one to do it, that the Ellis Island thing is a myth. Nobody changed names at Ellis Island. They were using ship's manifests and copying the names. Jews changed their names to avoid social anti-Semitism. And it wasn't easy, because you had to change your name in 1,000 forms. It was a whole thing, right? Perhaps some of them were ashamed that they did it, and so they told Ellis Island stories, but it's a myth, okay? Now, are we again reaching a point where American Jews, at least in some quarters, will need to mask their Jewishness, or at least their Zionism? Maybe we're already there, right? But for the most part, I think people would prevail. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. That was terrific. I'm really looking forward to digging in. I'm just going to take a quick minute to introduce myself and my museum. My name is Beatrice Gurwitz, and I am the executive director of the Capital Jewish Museum, Lillian and Albert Small Capital Jewish Museum. How many people have been to that museum? Nice. I have a slight advantage. So just to give you a sense of what we do as a museum, so we are a museum focused on the Jewish experience in the DC region, DC, Maryland suburbs, Northern Virginia. And that means looking at the story of Jewish life in this region. When did Jews get here? Where did they move? What institutions did they build? Where did they move from the first places they arrived? How did they move into the suburbs? What institutions did they build there? And it's also the story of all the ways that Jews have engaged in the political process in DC, right? So all of the advocacy groups, all of the people who have served in government, all of the high-level diplomacy that has happened here. So in a way, our focus is certainly is narrower than the Weitzmans, which has this big national purview. But because we have this DC focus, there's sort of a mandate to focus in more on certain things. And just to sort of set the stage for our conversation, when it comes to the local Jewish relationship with Israel, or the Jewish relationship with Israel and DC, this enters into the picture in a couple of ways. One is just all of the sort of grassroots engagement you see with Israel and communities across the region. So, synagogues doing, Israel appeal, or having a hostage table, or having seats set aside for the hostages over the course of the last couple of years. It's also all of the activism that happens downtown, both the advocacy groups of all of their different stripes, the protests, the rallies, like that's all within purview for us, as is the sort of high-level diplomacy that has taken place. And for us, this question of how we capture this history, how we showcase this history on our walls, leads to constant fascinating questions, which I'm really looking forward to digging in with Dan today. But I will just start with a sort of easy one, but the most basic question that I think we get asked so frequently as museum people: how do you define your audience, and how do you define your Jewish audience and your non-Jewish audience? What makes them both come in the door? And I'm just going to tack one more thing on. What do you think of as your sort of primary pedagogical goals for those different audiences?
Yeah. So I'll start with a second. For our Jewish visitors, it's about strengthening a sense of belonging. So the more informed, the more you know, the stronger your Jewish identity is. For the non-Jewish visitors, it's about combating ignorance at various levels. That's where it kind of touches on combating anti-Semitism, because at least partially, anti-Semitism is based on ignorance. I'm not saying that people who psychologically have a need to hate will ever be satisfied with information, but at least some of these people are simply taken by misinformation, disinformation, and myth because they just don't know. So that's that's about the second question. About the first one, so as you know, there are a lot of segments. An important part is what we do with students, Jewish and non-Jewish, and then there's just the visitor. But I believe that for both groups, just create a good museum. If it's good, if it's world-class, if it tells wonderful stories, they'll come. And they'll come not only regionally, but they'll come from the entire Northeast corridor. And that's what we're trying to do, is just create the best museum that we can.
So one of the things that we think about a lot when we think about educational programs and non-Jewish audiences is the Dara Horn critique in People Love Dead Jews, which is an indictment to an extent of Holocaust education and Holocaust museums. And the notion that these museums sort of miss the particularity of anti-Semitism, the particular logic of anti-Semitism, and also they leave people with the notion that the Jews are a dead people or a meek people, right? They don't introduce people to the vibrancy of Jewish life. How do you think about the role of the Weitzman, its educational programs, as sort of a complement to Holocaust education? And then I would add on to that, is there something about the particular nature of anti-Semitism in the US in the last 2 years that it feels like we as museums can have a response to, an intervention with respect to?
Yeah, so one of the differences between ANU and the Diaspora Museum is that the Diaspora Museum, those who visited know, was never a Holocaust museum, but it sure felt like one. Because Abakovno, the partisan, right? That was basically the central axis, AXIS, of the museum was persecution and death and Holocaust. That is sometimes referred to as the lachrymose conception of Jewish history, as it was coined by Salo Baron. And Anna was a break from the lachrymose conception. the Weitzman is, similarly to Anu, a museum of Jewish life. It does not overlook the Holocaust. There's a section, but it's not a Holocaust museum, and it's part of really the core of what it is. Going forward, I have a concern about Holocaust education that goes beyond Dara Horn's concern, which I agree with. And the concern is this. Holocaust is considered a very convenient entry point to schools, especially public schools. And the reason is that Holocaust education is mandated in, I think it's 23 states or maybe 25. And so the idea is, let's get a foot in the door through Holocaust and then expand and use it for anti-Semitism, et cetera, or anti-Semitism education. I have two problems with that. One, as far as I know, it doesn't really work effectively. And so Holocaust remains Holocaust. And the second part of it just remains a foot in the door, that's all. It's just Holocaust. And let me tell you, for young kids, something that happened 80 years ago, it could have happened 800 years ago. There's absolutely no distinction of time frame. It happened a long time ago in another place, and that's it. My growing concern recently is that I'm beginning to be afraid that Holocaust education may be a way to introduce the Gaza genocide narrative. Why are we teaching a genocide that happened 80 years ago when there's one happening right now under our nose? I could so imagine this coming from teachers and parents and school administrators that I think we may actually be introducing a Trojan horse into the education system. I don't have anything to back it up except for my paranoia.
I'm gonna, now that you've put that in, sort of brought that into the conversation, I'm gonna sort of bring another conversation about educational discourse into our conversation. And I recognize that ours are museums that are focused on the American Jewish experience. But we're hearing a lot, and I think today is in this spirit, about needing to introduce young people to more complex narratives about Israel, that what they've gotten in day schools and camps is too simplistic, and then they are confronted with more complex reality, and they don't know how to respond to it. And then the other story that we hear a lot about is needing to introduce American Jews and Israelis to Palestinian narratives more forcefully. I don't know that there is a role for our institutions in this milieu because we are so focused on the American Jewish experience, although maybe I can think of some, but I'm curious about what your thoughts are on that.
You know, it's a question that we all grapple with because even before October 7th, we know that we've heard this testimony again and again. I was brought up in the Jewish education system. We never heard the other side. Once I was exposed to it, I've been lied to my entire life, right? We heard this. It's a complex question because I don't know if inoculation that is introduced, just enough of it to inoculate. I don't know if you approach this cynically. I don't know that it works, and it's a very difficult question. Let me make it more difficult by reminding us that as museum directors, we have all sorts of constituencies, and it's very difficult to introduce, I would say, revolutionary concepts or without attracting a lot of criticism that we're not necessarily afraid of, but we need to take into consideration. It's a very complex proposition.
Yeah. I think that is certainly true, and the way that it seems to me that we could intersect in this, and this I think plays very well with your points about making decisions. Is how do we talk about the diversity of relationships in the Jewish community, right? Because by showcasing a diversity of relationships and opinions in the Jewish community, you sort of say different perspectives.
She's smart. That's a very good,
yeah. Different perspectives are acknowledged to be part of the Jewish universe, right? You are validating by saying they are part of the Jewish universe. And I think that I know you don't have to deal with this struggle yet, but you will certainly need to with the permanent exhibition. But we as an institution are actively collecting artifacts at all times. I'm seeing an artifact donor back there in Sharon. And we're collecting artifacts about all sorts of different things, federal workers, Jewish communal life, but we've also been collecting artifacts related to the Jewish world in DC post-October 7th. And that looks like rally posters, protest posters. It looks like photographs from synagogues, dog tags, all sorts of things that have become part of the material culture of the Jewish world in DC. But this question of how you collect in a way that is representative is extraordinarily tricky, right? What is the right balance? We don't have good numbers on, X numbers of Jews in this area believe this thing and affiliate with this organization or go to this synagogue. So this question of how you make choices that feel reasonable when you're collecting and showcasing stories that feel representative of that diversity is extraordinarily hard.
Yeah, no, I first of all, your first comment was really, really on point, and I think that introducing a more diverse picture through the diversity of the Jewish people is probably a smart way of going about it. The other question of being of collecting and displaying in proportion is a really tricky question because proportions change. We really grappled with that at ANU because how many people, who knows how many Jews there were before World War II? 16 to 17, okay. Of those, how many were Mizrahi Jews or Sephardic Jews? Non-Ashkenazi Jews? It's about 1 million. It's about 1 million. Okay? Mainly in Islamic countries. There were very few. There were still some Sephardic. So there's a distinction between Mizrahi and Sephardic. So Sephardic is Turkey and Greece and some in America, right? But not in significant numbers. But there were 1 million Jews in Islamic countries. Now you open the Museum of the Jewish People, and so with regard to everything before 39, is that what you do? You do a 90-10 split? Or whatever, 80-20, whatever, however you want to, right? Of course you don't. Especially because in Israel, it's more like a 50-50 split. Okay, your audience is a 50-50 split. So the question of proportionality, if you try to do it arithmetically, you're going to get lost. You just need to make sure that various narratives and groups are represented, not necessarily in proportion to their number. At ANU, when we did a section about Jewish denominations, Reconstructionists were there, although Reconstructionists are all of what? 100,000 people? I'm not even sure.
I think that's a fascinating approach to the display. I think that one of the things that feels challenging about the collecting, and I think this is not such a risk, but I'll just articulate it as a risk, is how terrible it would be if we collected disproportionately and created a skewed point of view of what the Jewish world in DC looked like at this moment. Now, the reason I think it's not such a big risk is I'm very glad to add things to our archives and be able to tell broader stories and for researchers to use them, but there's other ways to get information as well. But having an archival record that is reflective is important. And so, yeah, I do think that if you get hung up on proportionality, there's no way to get it exactly right. And I think one of the things I think about is that in DC, it's so easy to think that political engagement happens only downtown, or to privilege the kinds of political engagement that happens on the mall with protest signs and T-shirts, et cetera. But there's all sorts of ways that people engage with politics or Israel in their home communities, right? And so making sure that we don't overprivilege what's happening downtown and lose sight of the everyday life that Jews engage with and how it intersects with politics or anything else for that matter. Okay, I will move us on to another question. So I wanted to pick up on this question you raised about making choices in the stories you tell and the Jewish mobsters specifically. And I think it is a perfect example because figuring out how we tell stories of harder moments in the Jewish past when people who were members of the Jewish community might not have acted in the way we would now, may not have acted very well by the standards of their contemporaries even. is tricky business because if we don't do it at all, it feels like we are not a credible institution that's telling full and complex stories. If we do it too much, there's a fear of perpetuating anti-Semitism. And I think relatedly, there's a desire to talk about Jewish accomplishment or contribution. But if you, as you were alluding to, if you focus on it too much, there is a fear that you are playing into anti-Semitic stereotypes of Jews having disproportionate power and being able to control all sorts of things. So there feels like danger under every narrative in some way. But I wanted to talk about it specifically with respect to the question at hand today. Are there dangers in certain narratives about Jewish engagement with Israel, the complexity of Jewish relationships with Israel? What risks might we run with certain choices? What risks might we run with other choices? Like, what do you think the concern is there?
It's a lot easier for me to answer with regard to history.
Great.
Than the present.
I like history.
But I have a very relevant example. So we're working on this exhibition that I told you way too much about. The question arises, what do we do with slavery? So these Jews in St. Eustatius, and quite frankly, their counterparts here in America, own slaves. Do you not mention it at all? Do you let it overtake the entire exhibition in an apologetic way? Well, after much deliberation in the, with the academic advisory board that is led by Professor Sarna and includes Pamela Nadel and Laura Liebman, we decided that the approach would be, yes, just like everybody else. That would be the approach, which happens to be historically accurate, contrary to some anti-Semitic myths. And so slavery will have a place in the exhibition, will be mentioned in the exhibition, but it's not going to overtake it. I think that if we had worked on this exhibition, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, it would have overtaken the whole thing. The sentiment would have had it overtake the whole thing, and then I wouldn't want to do it. So I would have dropped it. If what it would have entailed is for this story to be overtaken by slavery, I would have said drop the whole thing. We're not doing it. So, but it's much trickier. Your question is a much more difficult one, and yeah, it's a challenge. I don't know. That's the honest answer.
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple more questions, but we can also move to questions from the audience as well. I'll pose one more while we wait for that. So I think we're sitting here a little bit wringing hands about how we would talk about the North American or American Jewish community's relationship with Israel and our museums. What kind of thought was there given at ANU to talking about the Israeli relationship with the diaspora as you were curating?
Yeah, so on the one hand, there was a spirit, an iconoclastic spirit, let's do away with the narrative of the old diaspora museum. On the other hand, there were some voices that carried it to the degree that we don't even need to talk about the establishment or founding of the State of Israel. Let's just talk about post-World War II and the establishment of the two great centers, North America and Israel, not even stating or not even devoting any attention to the very founding of the State of Israel. So I think on the whole, the attempt was, let's create a Jewish museum regardless of the fact that it's on the Tel Aviv University campus. And let's talk about these relationships as objectively as possible and not overrepresent the Israeli-centric narrative. And I think we pretty much arrived at that. And by the way, that opened ANU up to a lot of criticism from Israelis. A lot of Israelis, mostly on the conservative, right-wing side of the spectrum, thought and think the museum isn't Israeli enough. Why is there not a whole wing devoted to just Israel and Zionism? Well, because the academic advisory board of that museum tried to look proportionately at Jewish history, and yes, Israel, top 3 for sure. but not the only one, but not the only story.
So I can't remember if this is there, but like in terms of the subject itself of Israeli perceptions of the diaspora, right? Like work of the Jewish Agency or different schools of thought on the negation of the diaspora, like these kinds of conversations that have been part of, Israeli life. Was there a conversation about sort of inserting that narrative into the museum itself?
Yeah, and in fact, it's inserted through those other layers that I talked about.
Got it.
As docents and guides and educators take groups through, those are the kind of softer narratives that you blend in with what you say, and there's no section devoted to it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, my last question is this, and you've alluded to this. I suggested that I said that we are collecting artifacts related to the past 2 years. To my mind, it is too soon to display those artifacts. The emotion associated with them, the initial reactions that people have will be no different than reading different people's opinions in a newspaper or listening to a rabbi speak about these issues. And that we're better positioned to hold on to them in our archive, to put them up when we've had time to reflect, when the curatorial team has had time to reflect on them, when audiences are able to engage in a slightly more dispassionate way about this really tremendous last 2 years that we have all lived. Do you have a rule of thumb of when it's too soon?
I think your instinct is probably right, but on the other hand, we're expected to say something. The way, so at ANU, we did something we found a creative way of doing it. And we opened an October 7th exhibition in February of 24. So this is 4 months after October 7th. And we said to ourselves in internal deliberations, everything that you say, we're in it. It's not even, right? And the way that we did it is through art. So the one way, maybe, of transcending time is let's do something about artists' conception of everything that's happening. So you're not depicting anything factual, but you're actually looking through, or not even looking, you're presenting people's lens on what happened. And that may be a good way of, for now, of solving the issue.
We have time for some questions. And I'll just remind everybody to ask a question, not to make a speech.
Hi, my name's Deborah Friedman. Both of you are very involved in what happened on October 7th because both of your museums have been traumatized. I'm aware that you received over 10 letters to the Weitzman Museum.
You got the guy. The FBI actually got him.
I know the guy, but he hasn't been convicted. He's still out there doing what he does. So I'll talk to you afterwards.
He's been arrested.
He's been arrested, but he's not. He's not
been convicted.
What are you doing? What are you doing now? Because I say, when I talk about that and what this man did, I said, people say, oh, he's a nice guy, didn't mean to, but there's a lot of repercussions. And I wanted to ask you about those. I mean, the kinds of things you have to do in order to protect yourself when it becomes evident there's going to be an attack on you or that there has been attacked on you.
So the guy you're referring to is someone who over the course of 2 years sent us threatening letters. But there was another guy who, on 2 successive weeks, defaced the museum. We had hostages, free the hostages with an Israeli flag. And on 2 successive weeks, somebody came, spray painted the sign. And they got that guy as well. But the thing is this. On the one hand, you ratchet up security because you have to. I'm sitting next to the executive director of the Capital Jewish Museum. I mean, how much worse does it get? It doesn't. So you ratchet up security, but you don't want to scare your visitors away. So you do it quietly. So one part of you says, I want people to know that we've got armed guards at all time. But then you say to yourself, if that's the message, people will say, fine, what's the armed guard going to help me, right? And so you do it, but you do it, it's a multi-layered approach to what you do. I have to say, following the Capitol Jewish Museum attacks, there was a definite downward spiral in attendance at the museum. So these guys at least temporarily won. Oh, you have to be checked to get in at our museum as well.
Absolutely.
Okay, next.
Yeah, and I'll just say one more thing. Like I think Dan said it beautifully and lovely, having it come out of his mouth. That's exactly what happens. Our security is very intense, and I think also you just have to take strength from your mission of educating about the Jewish people, right, and hoping that people will come in, learn about Jewish experiences, and that, like, this is an essential mission, and that we have a story to tell. We have teachers to educate, we have students to educate, and you just have to move forward with a focus on the essential work that we are doing despite all of that deep anxiety.
Thank you guys so much for being here. My name is Lucia Fischel. I'm a grad student, but I was an undergraduate student who was very involved in student politics and congressional politics during October 7th, and then after. I was very involved in dialogue. And I just kind of saw, so I'll make this very brief, I just saw firsthand a lot of internal division among lots of Jewish folks who I know and lots of other people, where they either move deeper into Jewish institutions, the kind of institutions, material culture you talked about, they went the opposite way, so were active in other spaces, anti-Zionist spaces, spaces that were against Israel, right, and so forming their own Jewish collective in another way. And then there was this like silent majority, where it was just most of the Jewish students I knew, and this might be very specific to the ecosystem of AU, I'm an AU student, they just were not participating. None of the material culture, none of the institutions, none of anything. And I'm just very curious with both of you, because you talked about material culture and the record, is there like a record of those students who were, or those people, not active or anti-Zionist the other way, and of that internal division, not just, so I'd be really interested in that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a terrific, terrific question, and it definitely is the sort of pitfall of what we're doing. One museum asked people to just sort of record quick snippets of their reaction to everything post-October 7th. Those are embargoed for 10 years, but I think that the goal was to sort of get at hearts and minds across the spectrum. I don't know how many people participated, and I think probably the people who you're talking about in the middle probably wouldn't have, right? And so I think, I think that's where programming and sharing experiences comes in, right? Being able to say, how do we pull in people who are not just the most vocal activists, but everyday people in our community, and learn from their experiences, so we can hear anecdotes like yours that are sort of more reflective and are a reality check to those of us who are just like, well, it's either the surge or you're anti-Zionist, right? Like, getting that nuance in the middle, I think, is where programming can come in for us for sharing those kinds of stories.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. But also, please note, what you're describing is exactly what I was talking about. Now, there's a social and professional price for being Jewish and or Zionist. We're there. We're there of people keeping silent about their opinions because there's just too high a price to pay for being identified now as Jewish or Zionist. We're there.
Thank you for the marvelous things you've given us to think about. I'm wondering, as a journalist, your museums are both funded by private philanthropy, but do you feel a risk with the politics of both countries, Israel and the U.S. now, where, at least here, museums are being told what they can and cannot exhibit, and erasing all kinds of things? Do you feel a risk from Jewish philanthropy, who may be on one side of an issue or another?
So ANU is partially owned by the state of Israel. Okay, so it's a public benefit company owned by Jewish Agency, World Zionist Organization, World Jewish Congress, and the State of Israel. And my entire 12 years there was never any intervention by the government of Israel in the content, although about 20% of the budget comes from the state. Okay? So what I'm saying is, even government ownership doesn't necessarily mean intervention. Okay? Now, with regards to the United States, we know what the current administration has been demanding of Smithsonian institutions. And it's still the process is still undergoing. I think that in general, it's one thing to say, we're a conservative government, museums have been a liberal space. We think that the conservative voice should be heard in museums. Then what you do is you appoint conservative directors of museums. That's 100% legitimate, especially when there's appropriations involved. What is not legitimate, and we know from other regimes in history, is purging museums. And let's hope we don't get there.
It's a really good question, and something that I certainly think about a lot. I would say that, for the most part, our supporters recognize that it's important to be telling complicated stories, and have continued to be supportive of that. We have an exhibition next year, mark your calendars, opening in March, on the Hollywood blacklist, and blacklists at different moments in history. Maybe, just maybe, it'll be a blockbuster, but we never know. It's actually a traveling exhibition, originally from the Jewish Museum of Milwaukee, then it went to Skirball, it was just at New York Historical, and now it's coming to us. And it sort of traces the history of Red Scares, starting with post-World War I, anti-fascism, politics during the New Deal. Then you sort of get into the post-war period of the Hollywood blacklist, and also the very, very significant purges of the federal government during that period as well, right? We're adding on the story about DC being a DC-focused museum. And, I think that people feel like it's resonant in this moment, but have been supportive of the ways that it is resonant in this moment. And being not a government institution, and not an institution with very significant federal funding, we tell stories that our constituencies think need to be told and will resonate with our audience. So we've been able to sort of traverse it in that way.
I was in Israel in June and visited the Anu Museum, and the exhibit about October 7th was just unbelievable. I mean, we were walking through the museum, and there's talking, and people are laughing. And people, as they walk into that area, which was downstairs, it's like all of a sudden becomes quiet. The art was unbelievable. And there was this mural on like a whole wall, like this size. I think it was from a kibbutz, if I remember. People were just standing there. And we were all crying. And this was before, in Israel, there were a lot of pictures from what was actually happening on the kibbutzim. So I commend you. I think that was one of the most fantastic exhibits.
Thank you. That's the power of art, right?
Yeah, that's why I told you.
So I think, okay,
Someone has been
I think
very
we have
patient
one,
in the
yes,
front
yes,
row.
yes. Just want to say we have one more question. And then, speaking of the power of art, the next panel starts at 2:30 with the voices of the writers. So after this question, please join us. for that.
Donald Myers.
That's going to be a nasty question after I fought for you.
No, it's not. I have a question about the Weizmann Museum. We're a member of it, and I went there, and it does create a sense of pride in what the Jews have accomplished. I'm getting literature that you're in the negotiations to be part of the Smithsonian. Explain to us what's the advantage of doing that, as well as the disadvantages of doing that, and what's the status of it?
Yeah, so the status is that a congressional committee is to be formed, commission is to be formed. They were supposed to announce its 8 members, 4 from each party, in February. We're in November, and they haven't announced the members. They blame the shutdown, but the shutdown is recent. Come on. And then this commission has up to 2 years to deliberate and present its findings, and then there will be more deliberation and more conversation. So it's a multi-year process. The reason that we're pursuing it is because being a Smithsonian, not an affiliate, but an actual Smithsonian, one, it's a declaration. It's an affirmation of the fact that Jews are part of the fabric of American society. And if there is the Museum of the American Indian, by the way, it's still called the Museum of American Indians, really weird. And in the works, there's the Latino American Museum, and here the Museum of African American History, et cetera. Why not Jews? And it's a declaration that we think is very, very important. Two, there is a certain seal of approval of quality that comes with being a Smithsonian. And there's a certain stability that comes with being a Smithsonian. And so, but on the other hand, it comes as a trade-off with some of your autonomy. And that's why we'll deliberate and we'll see what it entails. We're different than all of the other museums in that if we come in, we're coming in with our own building, with our own endowment, right? So maybe we'll be in a position to negotiate a large degree of autonomy. That's yet to be determined. In any case, the process will survive the current administration. It's a multi-year process. And yes, there are arguments to both sides. It's a complicated proposition.
Complicated, that's the word today. Thank you so, so much.